Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to God's Answers to Your Questions, the Wednesday afternoon edition. We're glad to be back after taking a break uh, last week. You will notice that we are earlier this week. This will be our normal time instead of 4:15. Me and Simon decided it would be better for both of us to have this program at 2:30, and it will go to about roughly 3:15, 45-minute period. So look for us at this time every Wednesday. Yeah, it is Wednesday. I'm blowing my days. Thank you all for joining us, and if you have questions, please feel free to submit on Facebook and YouTube. Let me bring in our host, Simon Harris. How you doing, Simon?
Doing much better, CJ. We weren't here last week because I was sick, and
Yes,
it was a rough week last week, but I feel much better. Thank you.
we're good. Glad to have you back. Well, let's pray and then we'll get started. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your continued faithfulness. Uh, Even when we sin and when we stumble and when we keep repeating those same sins, Father, help us to overcome our temptations, Father, and submit to you in all things. We love you. Thank you for your faithful brother and to help us in time of need. Please help us as we study your word. Help it to be truthful. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right, so CJ, we're in the middle of Hosea 9. And so in Hosea 9, it's this section of Hosea where God through Hosea, is telling Israel what's going to happen to them. He's already made the case against them that they are sinning, that they're behaving like the pagans around them. And because of that, they're going off into Assyrian captivity. The Assyrians are going to come and take them away. And so in chapter 9, one of the things he really emphasizes is what they're losing. And so in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, they're losing joy. So there's the loss of joy that their
Right.
sin has brought. And, he tells them not to rejoice anymore because they're harlots chasing after false gods. And then in 3 to 6, he talks about all the spiritual blessings that they're going to lose. They're not going to get to live in God's land anymore. God's not going to accept any sacrifices anymore, so they're not going to be able to worship God anymore. And they're not going to have their feast days anymore. When they're off in captivity, they're not going to get the days off that they were supposed to get off, and they're not going to be feast days because they're in captivity. And so they're losing their inheritance. They're losing the thing that makes them uniquely God's people, is what I mean. And then in 7, 8, and 9, he says they're going to, the hope, they're losing hope. We have a phrase where there's breath, there's hope. Well, not for these people. God is pretty much determined that they're going to go off into captivity. There's no changing that. And so they don't have a future to look forward to. Punishment is coming. And he ends the section in verse 9, so in chapter 9, by saying it's just like the days of Gibeah. So that points back to the days of the judges. And you remember that horrible phrase in the book of Judges is, there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in the sight of their own eyes.
Right.
And so things were really bad in those days. He specifically, this mention of Gibeah reminds us of a Levite who had a concubine that he chopped up into 12 pieces and sent all around Israel as a rallying cry against the men of Benjamin because of a heinous act that they tried to commit, and did commit, um, and they almost wiped out Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, because of that. So this just again just a really ugly time in Israel's history that he's reminding them of. So that's where we stopped last time. So we're ready to begin in chapter 9, verse 10, and in 10 to 13, God is just going to talk about how disappointed he is in them. So you want to read those verses, Hosea 9, 10 to 13.
Like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel, like the first fruit on the fig tree in its season. I saw your fathers, but they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the other things, to things of shame, and became detestable like the thing they loved. Ephraim's glory shall fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. Even if they bring up children, I will bereave them till none is left. Woe to them when I depart from them. Ephraim I have seen was like a young palm planted in a meadow. But Ephraim must lead his children out of slaughter.
Okay. So he says, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. You know, if you were out in the desert, and you'd been lost in the desert for some time, and then all of a sudden you came across a grapevine full of grapes, what's that represent to you?
Hope, uh, food, life.
That's exactly it. You know, and I would imagine that in that moment too, as you're eating them, and you're exactly right. That's exactly what I was looking for. You just add to that, think about that, probably the sweetest, juiciest thing you ever ate in your life. You know,
Right.
um, because you're hungry, you're thirsty, you're tired, and lo and behold, here you find grapes, in and so you're saved, and so you're refreshed, and so that's how what God intended Israel to be to him. And when he says, as the first fruits of the fig tree in its first season, this is kind of an idiom for the Jews about sweetness. You know, I think that we understand this. You know, you think about that first ripe tomato of the summer and how good that tastes, or the first ripe strawberry you get, first ripe peach that you get. I mean, it's just like
Right.
the best thing in the world. Well, that's what God wanted them to be. And so early on, that's how God viewed them. Just so pleasant. And he just, again, they were sweet to him. He loved them. It was great. This is what he wanted for them. But look, I mean, before the verse even ends, they came to Baal Peor, devoted themselves to shame, and became detestable. This Baal Peor is where Balaam um, convinced them. Remember, Balaam tried to curse them, but he couldn't.
Right.
But he convinced the Moabite women to go out and commit fornication with them in this religious rite. So even before they entered the promised land, they're already, more than just flirting, right? They are participating in idolatry. And God marks that as the beginning of the end for them. So even before they got into the promised land, they are already chasing after foreign gods. Think about this for a minute. Why did they have to uh, be in the wilderness for 40 years?
Because they didn't want to go into the promised land.
Yeah. And so that entire generation that came out of Egypt had to die, all except two guys, right? Joshua and
Right.
Caleb. So those people, that original generation, they came out of Egypt, got to Mount Sinai, and 40 days later, what were they doing? Making a golden calf.
Right.
That whole generation had to die. Now we got this new generation in their place, about to go into the promised land. What do? Worship idols again.
Right. Same thing. Hmm.
It's just like history just keeps repeating itself. And so they became detestable, he says. And I like this. It says they became detestable as I like the New King James even better. It says they became an abomination like the thing they loved. Idols are an abomination to God. When they worshiped the idols, they became like the idols,
Right.
an abomination to God. But there's also, it's really kind of interesting to think about that idea that you become like what you worship. Um, and so God wants us to be like him. And so that's why he commands us to worship him. But you think about how he describes idols. They're they're dumb, they don't act, they can't speak, they can't hear. And so when people worship idols, they become like people who can't hear, who can't speak, can't do anything, right?
Right.
It's really interesting to me how when we think about this in our society, I remember when I was a kid in school, they were teaching us that man is just like one of the animals, that's all we are. We're just a higher form of animal. And so I've noticed in my 55 years that most people in the world act like animals. And I wonder if it's because that's what we're telling ourselves. Instead of seeing ourselves as being made in the image of God, we think
Right.
we're just like animals. And that's why it's not a big deal in our society for a young man to pull out a gun and shoot another young man. I mean, animals kill each other all the time.
I think about Paul's words in Romans 1 how these ungodly people worship the creature rather than the creator. And it's really interesting how he paints that. Because it's really nonsensical. Why would you worship something that I'm gonna use this bulletin as an example. I didn't make the bulletin, but one of our members made this bulletin for the Mount Moore Church of Christ. Why would you worship the uh, this bulletin instead of thanking? Well, we don't worship the guy who creates the bulletin, but you get the parallel. Why would you worship and adore the creature rather than the creator?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense at all, does it? Um, so, since they have become testable in verse 11, their glory is going to fly away. And, you wonder, what in the world is he talking about? Their glory flying away. Where he tells us in the very next sentence, no birth, no pregnancy, no conception. For the Jewish people back in those days, to have a large family showed the blessing of God. And it's kind of funny because for a long time, having a lot of kids was a way for a man to show he was manly. My grandmother and grandfather, my grandma and grandpa Harris, had 13 children. I remember one time this,
No.
this lady asked my grandma, she was, I think, my cousin's new wife. And she just found out my grandma had 13 children. And she said to my grandma, "How in the world did you have 13 children?" And my grandpa, who was just a little bitty feeble old man, he stepped up and he said, "Because she was married to a man, you know." And so we understand that in a lot of cultures and a lot of places, having a lot of kids is a good thing. It's a blessing. It's a glory. And so he said, all that's going to be taken away. And for Israel especially, one of the promises to Abraham was descendants more numerable than the sand on the seashore, right?
Right.
And so he says, all that, I'm taking that away. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. God is the one who's in control of all of that. He says,
Well,
it's not happening.
we're not even gonna try again this time, like I did last time. I killed off the first generation in hopes to raise up a second. I'm gonna kill you off, but I'm not gonna raise up a third.
Yeah. I'm
What?
not replacing these. I think that's exactly right. It's also cool to think about this. When they went down to Egypt in the days of Joseph, they were like 70, 75 people. And they grew to this great nation. They multiplied so much that the people in Egypt started fearing them. And
Right.
so while they're in captivity, their numbers multiply. But now they're in the promised land and God is going to cut them off. And so God is going to stop the births. You know, we've talked about this before, that the land of promise was described as a land that flows with milk and honey. And so in order for there to be milk, there has to be babies. And he's cutting that off. And so it will no longer be a land of milk and honey. Um, so then no birth, no pregnancy, no conception, no replacements. And then he said, even the children they have in verse 12, they're going to be sent out to slaughter. You know, he says that he's going to bereave them so that not a man is left. Israel's best and bravest men will be sent out to fight the Assyrians, and the Assyrians will kill them all. And so that's absolutely the idea there. So they go from this blessing of great birth and a great nation to this curse of
Right.
barrenness. Um, Verse
Yeah.
13, you know, God knows exactly who um, they are. And that's what he's saying there. Um, you know, he intended them to be a palm tree planted in a pleasant meadow, but they're not that at all. And so Ephraim will bring out his children for slaughter. That's what's going to happen to him. You have any comments or?
No, it's just really sad. You read through this and you think, wow, it, what about the promise? What about how's the seed promise gonna get fulfilled? It sounds like God's just gonna wipe out the nation, but he well, I guess I want your thoughts on that.
So I think that's a really good thought. That's a good question. Um, and so, first of all, we remember that this is just the 10 northern tribes. Ephraim refers to those 10 northern tribes, and these are the ones who are going to be wiped out. And so Judah and Benjamin in the south will remain. And among those people, he will find a remnant. And I think that there's a possibility even that well, we do know that there were faithful people still in Israel. I mean, Hosea is one of them. So he's speaking to the nation in general here, but he knows who are his. And as the New Testament says, God knows how to reserve the unrighteous for punishment and save the just. And so there's probably a remnant here, but
Right.
again, he most certainly still has Judah and Benjamin reserved for himself as well. Good thought. Anything else?
I think that's it. That was my only wait a minute.
Okay.
Because I knew Jesus came somehow, but I was like, wait a minute, if God's gonna totally wipe them out, how did this happen?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So now you know. Good
Yeah.
question. Really good question. And now others know as well, or
Yeah.
at least have the ability to know. Okay, so what we have in 14 to 17, there are times where prophets speak and it really sounds like God talking. And so it is like it's either God speaking through them or them talking, like God would talk. And I don't think we have to make that decision. We understand that the prophet is God's spokesman. And so the prophet is a godly man. He's going to sound like God, and God absolutely speaks to the prophets. And so that's what's going on here. So here's God's response. So he's standing back, looking and seeing what Israel is going to lose. And this is what he says about that. He says, give them, O Lord, what will you give them? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breast. All their evil is at Gilgal. Indeed, I came to hate them there because of the wickedness of their deeds. I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more. All their princes are rebels. Ephraim is stricken. Their root is dried up. They will bear no fruit. Even though they bear children, I will slay the precious ones of their womb. My God will cast them away because they have not listened to him, and they will be wanderers among the nations. So um, he's like, well, if this is what you're going to do, God, then what are you going to do? Give them miscarriages and dry breasts. And so here's what Hosea is saying. Hosea is looking at this situation. And so what would be better, to see your sons go off to war, or for your son to miscarry, or for your baby son to be dead in birth? And given the choice, Hosea says, don't let these babies even be born to go out and do that, is kind of the idea. It would be more humane for them to die as babies than to grow up and be killed by the way the Assyrians are going to kill them. And so that's what he's saying. He's like choosing the lesser of the two. And you also have this idea of God's judgment being complete. If there are no babies, then God's judgment comes out, and so let it be done, is kind of the idea. And it's interesting, he says, all their evil is at Gilgal. That's an interesting place to mention. When Joshua and the children of Israel, after Moses died, crossed the Jordan River, the first place they camped in the promised land proper was Gilgal. So this kind of marks the beginning place of them entering the promised land. And God says that even there, I came to hate them. So even kind of at the beginning, he's showing once again, they did not deserve his blessings even from the beginning. And we also have this idea, he says in verse 15, that he's going to drive them out. So the very place they entered the promised land will be the very place they exit the promised land. And this is one of those times where we get to see again that God always makes sure that we reap what we sow,
Right.
It's kind of interesting, this connection. If you look back in verse 12, He says, "Yet I will bereave them until not a man is left. Woe to them indeed when I depart from them." So he's departing from them. And then in verse 15, "I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more." So you kind of have that dual idea. God's leaving them, and then God is pushing them out. So when you turn away from God and God leaves you, God pushes you out. I mean, it's not like you can hang out in God's house while you're rejecting Him. No, that's not the way it works. You're all with God, and God is all with you, or you're all outside God and not with Him at all.
That's right. God's not going to let them enjoy the land if they're not keeping up their end of the bargain.
That's
So
exactly
he's
right.
going to put them into captivity, drive them out.
That's it.
Just just like Jesus did with the mind changers. He drove them out of his house. I don't know if there's a connection there, but I see at least a similarity with Jesus driving the people out. Same imagery here.
Yeah. I think there is kind of interesting connection there. And I never really thought about it before, but they're worshiping these idols and trying to worship God as an idol for what they gain materially. And absolutely, that's the only reason those money changers existed in the temple. You know, they should have seen their job as being a service to the worshipers, but no, they're ripping the worshipers off. Yeah. So Ephraim is stricken. The root is dried up. Kind of reminds me of when Jesus curses that fig tree, and the fig
Yeah,
tree, it dries up all the way to the root to show again it's dead. It is dead. It is the point, and it kind of goes back to the point that you made a moment ago that there's not going to be a replacement generation for these folks.
right.
It's gonna and interesting that here Hosea is saying this to Ephraim, and in that uh, illustration, that miracle that Jesus performs, making that fig tree dry up, is pointing to what's going to happen to the Jewish nation in AD 70 when Jerusalem is destroyed. So it's kind of the same idea. It's kind of
Right,
cool to see that connection, understanding that this absolutely what Jesus was trying to teach them.
right.
Um, and so God is going to even slay the precious one of their womb. Now, what's really interesting to me about that is, again, we're thinking about this generation of God's people, comparing them to the people who came out of Egypt. Because if we go back and look at the people in Egypt, God protected the babies of the Israelites with the Passover, right? God gave them the Passover so that the death angel wouldn't kill their firstborn. But now here, God is even slaying babies in the womb.
I got another question about that. Why? Because Jesus makes it clear that babies are innocent. So why would is it because God is sparing them from even growing up in a wicked nation, or
Well,
because
in this situation, um, the babies are being killed as a punishment to the parents. So it's the parents suffering because of that. And I think it is in that instance that even though God is taking the babies from the parents, that the babies themselves get to be in paradise. And so I think that's kind of the idea. And you're right as well that that does end up saving them from the influence of their idolatrous parents as well.
right,
But again, we have to remember that death that physical death isn't the ultimate punishment, that spiritual death is the ultimate punishment. And
Right.
so while these babies are dying, um, when you get to live eternally, what difference does it make if you die in the womb or when you're 99 years old?
It doesn't.
But again, I think that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that question. So you again see that contrast there. Now, verse 17, I think this is kind of cool. God says, I will cast them away because they have not listened to him. And they will be wanderers among the nations. Um, so think about this. What did God do to Adam and Eve when they sinned?
Kicked him out of the garden.
Cast them out because they didn't listen, right?
Right.
Because God said to them, eat that tree and you die. Serpent said, you shall not die. And they listened to the serpent instead of God. And so he cast them out of the garden. So the same punishment Adam and Eve received, now they're receiving. Also think about this. What was Cain's punishment for killing Abel?
He was going to be a wanderer.
He was going to be a wanderer all the days of his life. And again, the same reason, because he didn't listen. God told him. God said, sin lies at the door. You need to be
Right.
master over it. And if you do well, you don't have to be angry. And he didn't listen. And so he became a wanderer. So it's kind of cool to see that connection in 17, that the punishment for sin is always the same. You get cast out and you become a wanderer.
Yep.
So
That's
that's
right.
what's going to happen to him.
Even in Jesus' parable of the wedding feast, the guy that wasn't ready is cast out and kind of wandering in outer darkness.
It's exactly right. And the same is true about the one talent man in the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. So yeah, that's a cool connection as well. So one last thing to point out about these verses is, so here at Gilgal, in these last three verses that we just read, last four verses that we just read, here at Gilgal, this is where God shows no mercy and Israel becomes not my people, which connects us right back to the name of the children. That's kind of cool, isn't it?
Yeah.
You got anything else in those verses?
Well, in chapter 9, like we were saying a couple weeks ago, it kind of connects back to a reversal of the three promises. I'm going to take away your land, verse 3. Your nation's going to be scattered, and because of that, the, the promise looks like the promise is not going to come. But we know it does come through Judah. But so it's cool to see the reversal of the three promises that God made to Abraham in this chapter.
Yeah. No, I'll be honest, I hadn't seen that. I think that's really cool. I think that's a really good observation. God reversing that. And I think it would be fair to say that he is cutting off their seed. So he's cutting them off from the land, he's cutting them off as a nation, and he's cutting off their seed. I think that's a really good observation. I'll be adding that to my notes after this is over today. Because I also saw, I like yours better, but I also saw that reversal in verse 6, almost like a reversal of creation, that this beautiful land is now going to become desolate. So,
Right.
but yeah, and that is really often really cool to see. And what that should really remind us of, and what that should make us know, is that the only reason we have the blessings we have is because of God. And so when God steps back, those blessings go away. Even if you go to Genesis 1, without God, the earth is formed without form and void.
That's right. Creation comes with God. Without God, creation, well, there is no creator.
Comes
It's
chaos.
right.
Yeah, that's right. All right, I know we got a few minutes left, but I really don't think we should jump into chapter 10 because we
Okay.
barely get into it. So maybe we just call this one a day. Maybe let the kids out early today.
Alrighty. Thank you all for joining us. We will be back again, Lord willing, next week. If you want to contact us, you can reach us on Facebook. God's answers to your questions. Send us a message and I'll see it. And then on my YouTube channel, you can comment there. Thank you all, and God bless.